And our guest speaker is Daphna Joel, not Joel. And I'll tell you a little bit about her, but first she asked if all of you could turn on your cameras so she could at least see faces rather than talking to the universe. So why don't you turn on your cameras, all of you, for a second, and then she could just see who's there, get a sense of it. Yamuna, Sophia, thank you. Gayatri is Yamuna, doing her PhD at AMMACHI University in the Center for Women Empowerment and Gender Equality with Tarek, a wonderful Egyptian scholar. He and I have spent a lot of time together on things. So at least in India, the Israelis and the Egyptians talk and have a wonderful time and enjoy each other's company. Well, I'm not going to say everything about everybody. No, put your cameras on for a second. It doesn't have to be on all the time. So you're getting some of it at least, Afi.
I think you can kind of swipe up and down and see everybody.
Okay. About to talk about her briefly is really kind of silly in a way. She's done so much and done really interesting work. I'll just tell you one anecdote, and it'll give you a sense of the person who is here. There's something in Israel called the Alon Prize. The Alon Prize is awarded every year to about 20 PhD or postdoc students who are truly exceptional. It's for the whole country. We have 8 universities altogether in the country. It turns out that, and the people who get it are absolutely, or given the Alon Scholarship or Fellowship, are absolutely the top of the top. And they're in competition with each other. Mathematicians are in competition with historians and people in the arts, etc. So the people who receive it are really, really exceptional and hold out great promise. Daphne was one of the recipients of the Alon Fellowship, and not only does that hold promise and did hold promise, but she's really delivered it in incredible ways as well. She's one of the stellar people at the university, and she's contributed to the intellectual and cultural and scientific life of the university in ways that people, of course, had hoped would happen. And in her case, it certainly did happen. So Daphne is working in, now she's working in the brain sciences and has moved into the area of gender. And
You are muted.
We
cannot hear you.
Can everyone else mute, please?
Muted. I hope you heard what I said. If you didn't hear what I said, Daphne is brilliant. She is an absolutely stellar part of Tel Aviv University. And it's a great pleasure that you're coming here and getting up early in the morning to talk with us about your work on gender and the brain sciences. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for this opening, and thank you for inviting me. I'll share my screen, and if there are questions during my talk, so please, let's see. Do you see this switching, or did it change now? Yes, okay. So if you have a question during my talk, please write them in the chat, and from time to time I'll stop and see if you can tell me if there are questions there, or I can go and look. So I'll say a few more words about myself. I've been a neuroscientist for over 25 years now, and most of my career I worked on neural substrates of normal and abnormal behavior. And about 10 years ago, I changed my interests and started to study sex, gender, and the brain. And this was actually quite by chance. A great friend and colleague of mine retired, and she was teaching psychology of gender in our department. And when she retired, she asked me to replace her and take on this course. And it took me a year or two to decide to do this. And once I did, I read a lot about gender, because I wasn't a gender scientist or a gender scholar. And of course, as a neuroscientist, I read a lot about sex and the brain. And during this reading, I learned something very, very surprising about sex effects on the brain. And this is that they can be opposite under different conditions. So what you typically see in males under one set of conditions, you can see in females under another set of conditions, and vice versa. And this was, of course, very, very surprising. And it made me realize that anything or everything that I was thinking about sex and the brain or sex and behavior was not correct, and I need to rethink. And this started about a decade of studies, and I'll show a little bit of this to you now, which is really changing how not only me, but others are thinking about sex and its relations to other systems. So this is what I'm going to tell you today. And I want to start with the general scheme, or I was surprised because what I learned about the brain, and I'll show you a little later, is something very different from what we usually think about sex and the body, including the brain. So I guess you know this general scheme of sex effects on the body, or how we become males and females. So either we have XX or XY. This leads to the development of either ovaries or testes, and the hormones they produce leads to the differentiation of the genitals into male or female genitalia. And for over 60 years, it has been assumed that something similar is happening in the brain. So these hormones are also affecting the brain to become male or female. So the actual theory is a masculinization hypothesis, which assumed that the female brain is the default, and testosterone already in the womb is masculinizing the male brain to become a male, the brain of the male to become a male brain. And of course, this, under this hypothesis, this is the explanation of why we have women and men. So men have male brains, women have female brains, and now we understand why we have these two genders. So I guess you know this general story, and it has several characteristics. So first, there is a strong emphasis on differences. So we start with a very small difference at the level of the genetic chromosomes, and then this difference gets larger and larger. And at the end, we can really imagine that the women came from Venus and men from Mars, whatever. So differences. The second characteristic is that these differences are natural. So they are the results of genes and hormones. And this is my addition to the field, that these differences add up consistently within each individual to create two distinct systems, male brains, female brains, men, women, etc. So I'm going to focus on this last assumption and show you that this is not correct. But before I refute this, let's see where it emerges, or why do we have this assumption. So we all know that sex differences in the genitalia do add up almost always to create one of two distinct systems. So you can see here these great walls of vagina. This is an artwork from Jamie McCartney, and the great wall of male genitals, which I've created using Google Images. So you can imagine the type of ads I get since. But anyway, the reason I brought these here is that we can see that although there are quite a lot of differences within each sex category, so not all females look alike and not all males look alike, it's very easy to distinguish between male and female genitals. And for me, what's more important is that genitalia almost always come in a set. So babies are either born with a set of female typical organs or a set of male typical organs. And it is quite rare, estimated to be less than 1%, that babies are born with what we call intersex genitalia. So they have either some genital organs in the form intermediate between the male and the female. You can mute yourself. Yeah, thank you. Or they have either some genital organs in the male typical form and others in the female typical form. But as I said, this is very rare. So when we have, is there a problem or is just someone that forgot to mute themselves?
Vivek, please mute your mic, Vivek.
Thank you. When we have these images in front of us, it's quite easy to understand why scientists, lay people, etc., assumed that this is also happening in other systems. So when we think about sex and sex effects, we have these images of the genitalia, which come in two sets. And therefore, scientists assumed that if they find sex differences in brain or behavior, this would also add up consistently to create two sets. And actually, it makes quite a lot of sense, because you may assume that a man has in the brain male typical features and a woman will have in her brain female typical features. Why think that this is not the case? This is because what I showed you before. So, okay, I just want to show you this. Okay, this is blocking my way, okay. And this is just an example to show you that scientists indeed assume that sex effects on the brain similarly add up to create two systems. So this is a study from 2014 that studied the strength of connections in the human brain. And they assessed the strength of over 9,000 connections. And what you see here in the upper panel are connections that are stronger in male compared to female, and in the lower panel, connections that are stronger in females compared to males. The color code here is blue for intrahemispheric connections and orange for interhemispheric connections that run from one side of the brain to the other. And when you look at these images, it seems as if indeed men come from Mars and women from Venus, because it looks completely different. But to assume that these the upper panel is typical of males and the lower panel is typical of females, you must assume that males have only male typical connections and females have only female typical connections. So you assume that brains behave like genitalia, that they come in two sets. And you can see also in how the scientists write about the work or how they summarize the work, this is how they talk about brains. Male brains are like this, female brains are like that. So why suggest or why assume that this is not the case? And this is what I said in the beginning. The reason to suspect that sex effects on the brain do not add up consistently to create one of two distinct sets is because there is evidence from animal studies that sex effects can be opposite under different conditions. And because this is so different from anything that we know and think we know about sex effects, I want to show this in a single study. And this study, again in rats, looked at the density of dendritic spines. So what we see here is a neuron, and the green extensions are the dendritic, are the dendrites. And along the dendrites, you see the small red dots. These are the dendritic spines. And here we can see a piece of dendrite. So this is a dendrite. This was green in the previous picture. And the small dots here are the spines. And I added arrows to show the spines. And you can see a dendrite, a piece of dendrite from a male and a piece of dendrite from a female. And you can easily see the sex difference. So females have lots of spines, males have few spines. So we see that sex affects the brain. Something about sex, whether it's being XY or XX, whether it's a different type, level of hormones, we don't know exactly, but something about sex is affecting the brain. Typically, when we hear that sex affects the brain, we immediately continue to think that, okay, so there must be male brains and female brains. And what I want to do today is disconnect the two parts of the sentence. The first part is true. We have lots of evidence that sex-related genes and hormones affect the brain. But what I'll show you today is that these effects do not adapt to create two types of brains. So back to this experiment. In this experiment, they had another group of rats. And these rats underwent 30 minutes of stress one day before their brains were assessed. And again, we see a sex difference, but it is reversed. So what we thought was typical of males, few spines, we now see in the female, and what we thought was typical of females, lots of spines, we now see in the males. This is similar, if we go to the genitalia, just to understand how amazing this finding is as if I would go to a conference or to give a lecture. I will be stuck in traffic in the pre-Zoom time, be afraid that I'm going to be late to my talk, but then finally get there on time, even have time to go to the toilets, take my pants off and say, my penis is back. Okay, I hope you are smiling at home, but this never happens with genitalia. My clitoris would not turn into a penis, and your penis would not turn into a clitoris. But it happens a lot in the brain. So the type of interaction between sex and stress in this example or other manipulations has been demonstrated for many regions of the brain, for many features of the brain. I've showed you dendritic morphology, but it can also be the size of a specific nuclei or the density of receptors, and following many different manipulations. We just look at the effects of acute stress. It can be chronic stress. It can be stress of the mother when she's pregnant. This is all experiments in animals. And then if you look at the offspring, when they are adults, you can see this type of reversal of sex effects. So what is typical of males of a non-stressed mother can be typical of females of a stressed mother. And it can also be other manipulations. So simply housing rats, 1 in a cage or 4 in a cage, can reverse the effects of sex on certain features of the cortex, for example. And when you look at all of these studies together, as I have done about 10 years ago, what you realize is that these environmental events do not flip the entire brain from the male form to the female form or the other way around. They affect only some features. So even if I assume that at some specific point, let's say now, my entire brain is in the female typical form, then following such a manipulation or event, some features of my brain will change their form, others will not, and I will end up with a mosaic brain. Mosaic in terms of having both male typical and female typical features. If we were talking about the genitals, I would end up with an intersex brain. but I'm not using this term, but rather mosaic. A few years after this, coming up with this idea of the mosaic, I realized how we can test this in humans. And in collaboration with an expert in Yaniv Asaf, an expert from Tel Aviv University in imaging, brain imaging, and a group of students, we looked at the human brain. And we analyzed the brains of over 1,400 humans. And I'm going to show you only one analysis of subset of these brains. So we looked at MRI images. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. And we divided each brain into 116 regions of gray matter. So probably you know that the brain can divide into gray matter, where the neurons are, and white matter, when the connections between the neurons are. In other analysis, we also analyze the white matter, but I'm only going to show you an analysis of the gray matter. So 116 regions of gray matter. We assessed the volume of each region in each brain and created this Excel file. And I'm explaining because I'm going to use this. So in this Excel file, each human, each brain is a single line of 116 measures. Okay, so each column is a brain region and each line is a human. And we colored this Excel file. So according to the size of each region, compared to this region in all other brains. So if a region is relatively large to this region in other brains, then we painted it green. If it's relatively small, we painted it yellow. Okay, so we go each region in each brain and we color it this way. And this is what we have at the end. So on the left, you see brains of males. Again, each line is a single brain. On the right, brains of females, or men and women. And you immediately see the sex differences. So you don't need statistics, you don't need anything. You immediately see that at the group level, women have more green and men have more yellow. And this is a known difference. So with the method of analysis that we have used for the MRI, we know that women have on average more gray matter compared to men. And this is why they have more green, because green, remember, is larger. So the question is not whether there are sex differences in the human brains. There are many differences. You can see them now. I'm also not going to talk now, we can talk about it later, about the question of nature versus nurture. That is, where did these differences come from? I'm only going to ask whether these differences add up to create two types of brains, female and male, as sex differences in the genitalia most often do, and as people assume is happening in the brain, as this image on the right suggests, or do they mix up in each brain to create mosaic brains? And I think that when you look at these images, the answer is clear. So you can see that there are differences at the group level, but brains are not green and yellow. Most brains are unique mosaics of green, which is more common in females, and yellow, which is more common in males. So we can see that brains do not come in two types, even though there are sex differences. And one way to think about human brains is as belonging to a single population, when there could be some differences at the periphery. And the image that you are now seeing here on the left, and I'm going to use some technical terms, but it's not really important. So you can take these data, which is 116 volumes of each region, and we did a principal component analysis to reduce dimension. And what you see here is each brain is a data point on this two-dimension view, which is the two principal components showing the largest sex difference. And in red, you can see brains of women, and in blue, brains of men. And even if you didn't understand how we got to this image, what I want you to appreciate here is that most humans are in this dense center when there are men and women. So the brain types, if you want, that are typical of men and women are the same in this dense center. But there are some differences in the periphery. So for example, in this region where there are few brains relative to the dense center, you can see that there are more brains of men than women. In this region, there are more female brains. In this region, there are, again, more brains of women than men. So we can think of the population of human brains as belonging to a single, highly heterogeneous population, when most of us have human brains, which is this region in the center, dense region, and some rare brain types where we can see large sex differences. And this can account for sex differences in domains such as autism, for example, which is more common in males compared to females, or depression, etc. So these are rare conditions. Most humans are not autistic, where you can see large sex differences. But you do not see these differences in the typical male and female brain. We next wanted to test this hypothesis, which I just explained. And the way we did it, and we did several things. I'm again going to show you only one analysis, and I'm always giving you the reference. So if you want, you can read the original article. To test this hypothesis, is the typical female brain different from the typical male brain, or are they the same? We used an anomaly detection. So anomaly detection was originally developed to detect atypical computer activity. So of course, all of us, we want to protect our computer or iPhone, etc., from viruses and worms. We can do this by having an antivirus that knows all known viruses and then can detect them and defend us against them. But you also would like to protect your computer from future viruses and worms. So you do not know against what you are looking for, but you want to be able to detect that something suspicious is happening. And this is anomaly detection. So the principle is that this algorithm runs and learns the typical activity of your computer. And then after it learns, it runs in the background. And for any activity of the computer, it will ask, is this normal or abnormal? And if it's abnormal, it will alert you. And sometimes it's a virus and sometimes it's wrong, okay? But it can detect something that is abnormal. So the idea here was, let's do the same, but instead of training the algorithm on normal activity behavior, let's train the algorithm on brains of, let's say, females. So let's give the algorithm brains of females and let it learn what's a normal female brain, and then give the algorithm new brains of males, which it never saw, and brains of females, new females, not the one that it would train on. And let the algorithm decide for each brain whether it's normal or abnormal. And of course, then let's do the same using the sex category, using the other group. Now, if brains indeed belong to two types, female brains and male brains, then if we train the algorithm on female brains, it would detect many more females as normal as males. And the opposite, if we train the algorithm on males, it will detect many more brains of males as normal as brains of females. However, if I'm right, and we all come from this single highly heterogeneous population, when most of us are in this dense region, then it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if you train the algorithm on the red dots. It will detect a similar number of blue and red dots as normal, because most of the brains are here in this center. And again, if you get the same if you train on blue brains, right, on male brains. So this is a situation when we have very clear and opposite predictions, and this can help us decide which theory or which hypothesis is correct. So we first did a positive control just to make sure that our algorithm can detect two populations if these existed in the data. So we looked at the facial morphology of faces of two types of primates, capuchins and macaques. And I'll explain what we're seeing here. So for one time we build the model on macaques. So this will be in circles. And another time we build the model on capuchins. And what you see on the graph is, here is the number or ratio of capuchins out of capuchins that are classified as normal, and the ratio of macaques. So if we train the model on macaques, then you can see that the model never thinks that a capuchin is a macaque. So the ratio of capuchin classified as normal, that is as a normal macaque, is 0, and the other way around. So the model or the algorithm never makes a mistake and thinks that an individual from the other species is a normal example of the species. What happens with brains? With brains, we get the opposite. Okay, so you can see that instead of all the dots being on the axis, all the dots are along the y equal x axis. Okay, so it doesn't really matter whether you train on males or females. The number or the ratio of males classified as normal is very similar to the ratio of females classified as normal, and again in another data set. So it's the same idea. So what this shows us is that this type of results is more in line with this description of how human brains, or the population of human brains, that this description is. So we see that the brain architectures, because this is all about brain structure, that are typical of women are also typical of men, and vice versa. Can someone tell me if there are questions in the, or do you have, is this clear? We'll have some time for discussion at the end, but I just want to make sure that the idea of the mosaic is clear. So let me know if there are questions. So when you see these images, at least I am convinced, I hope you are too, but the sex binary is something that is very difficult to change. And I really like this citation from Sanz. The problem with the sex binary is that there has never been an hypothesis or a theory to test. It is an epistemological framework that runs behind, above, and beyond particular theories and research projects. And this is also true for sex effects on the brain, or for thinking about sex and the brain. So for the question, are there male and female brains? If you go 10, 15 years ago, the answer is clear. People talk about sex differences and they conclude that there are male and female brains. So there is no doubt in their minds that, that male and female brains are something else than two distinct systems. They think about male and female brains as if they are similar to male and female genitalia. And of course, this is not true. So I hope if one thing I could convince you is that this is not true. There is the male and female genitalia is a completely wrong model for thinking about sex effects on the brain. More modern descriptions would acknowledge that there is overlap between the distributions of men and women in brain features, and therefore will not talk about two distinct systems, but would talk about the typical male brain being different from the typical female brain, or talking about a continuum between the typical male brain and the typical female brain. And again, what I've showed you now is actually the first study that tested this hypothesis. So it's an hypothesis. It's not that someone showed this, but the assumption was that if there are sex differences in the brain, and as I showed you, there are many sex differences in the brain. So if there are differences, this means that the typical female brain is different from the typical male brain. And again, this is borrowing the logic of the genitalia to think about sex differences in the brain. Following my work, the mosaic that I showed you in the human brain, and also this work that I've just showed you, a new framing of the sex binary regarding the brain had emerged. And this framing says that brain structure builds on the finding that brain structure and function can be used to predict sex category, to claim that brains are indeed male or female. So now it's not, we're leaving aside the logic of the genitalia, of two of two distinct systems. And what we say instead is that if we can predict whether someone is male or female on the basis of the function or structure of this person's brain, then this means that there are male brains and female brains. So I call it the question of prediction. And I want to start with, it is possible, and we have showed it several times, it is possible to predict whether someone is male or female on the basis of the brain structure with about 70% accuracy. You can go higher with accuracy if you take brain size into account, because the largest differences between males and females in humans is the size of the brain. Brains of males are on average larger than brains of females. So you can predict whether someone is male or female on the basis of the brain anatomy. But my claim is that you cannot do the opposite. Okay, so if I know someone is male or female, I cannot predict his specific or her specific green and yellow mosaics that we've just seen. And to just, so I'll skip this because I want to talk about other things. Okay, I'll just show the end. So if ignore the upper part. So knowing that someone is female or male cannot help you predict which brain mosaic this person will have, while it can predict more than what you want to know about this person's genitalia. So if someone is female, I know that she will have female typical organs, but she will not have male typical organs. When it comes to the brain, I'm sure that this person will have male typical features in the brain and female typical features in her brain, and I have no idea to know which features will be in which form and what will be the combination. Okay, so we have lots of information about someone's genitalia if we know the sex category. We know very little information about the brain mosaic or brain structure. So the ability to predict that someone is male or female on the basis of the brain structure does not necessarily mean that sex is an important category in accounting for variability in brain structure or function. And I want to support this before moving on. I want to support this from the work of other scientists. And this is a study about the neural substrates of sexual arousal in humans using functional imaging. And what you can see is that when you compare the activity in brains of men and women in response to sexual stimuli, you can see some differences. Okay? And if you only knew this result, or you only saw this graph, then you say, wow, there are differences between how brains of men and women respond to sexual stimuli. And probably you would go on and say, now we understand why there are some differences between men and women in sexual behavior, etc. However, what these scientists did is put sex in context. So they didn't only look at sex differences, what most people do. They look also at the differences between brain activity, depending on the type of stimulus that they were using, how they presented the stimuli, the sexual orientation of the viewers, machine power, which is whether the MRI machine was, how strong it was, age and sex. And you can see that sex is the least important factor. So it explains the least amount of variability in brain activity in response to sexual stimuli. So actually, the differences that we see here are really not important. What explains variability in the brains of both men and women to sexual stimuli is stimulus type, presentation paradigm, sexual orientation, even machine power. The type of MRI that was used in the study is more important, explains more variability than sex category. So this is what I'm saying, that sex explains some variability, and this is important. I showed you that sex affects the brain. So it's not that our sex does not affect the brain, it's that because it interacts with other variables, it is not predicting. I cannot use your sex to predict what I will find in your brain. But it doesn't mean that sex is not important. It just means that it doesn't explain variability in human population of brains. And this variability is enough to predict on its basis whether you are male or female, but it doesn't mean the other way. It doesn't mean that sex is important. It just means that you can use it to predict a sex category. And this is another line of evidence. So what this group did is they looked at all fMRI studies that looked at sex differences in the brain in functional imaging. And the reasoning is like this. If brains of men and women belong to two types, doesn't matter how you find these two types, but if they belong to two types, then the larger the sample, the more sex differences you expect to find. Because we know that larger samples have more power to detect differences if indeed the samples come from two distinct populations. And on the other hand, if, as I suggest, brains of humans come from a single population, then you should not find this. So the larger the sample, you're not supposed to find more differences, because the truth is that we do not come from two populations, males and females. And what you see here in the finding is that there is no relation between the size of the sample and the number of significant differences. So again, this does not support the assumption that brains of men and women belong to two populations of brains, but rather to our claim that we all belong to a single population of brains. Okay, so let's go back to where we started, and we started from this assumption that the sex-related genes and hormones affect the brain as they affect the genitalia to create male and female brains. And this also leads to male and female natures, if you want, or the existence of two genders, women and men. So if there are no two types of brains, what about men and women? Are there men and women? Again, we know that there are differences between females and males in some cognitive abilities, in some personality traits, much larger differences in interests and in behavior. Again, I'm not asking where did these differences come from playing with dolls or balls or whatever. So I'm not interested in the source of these differences, but only in whether they add up to create two types of humans, girls and boys, men and women, etc. And to answer this question, we did something very similar to what I showed you with brains. We looked at the behavior, cognitive abilities, preferences, etc. of over 5,000 humans. And again, I'm going to show you only one analysis. And in each data set, we looked for the variables showing the largest differences between women and men in that specific sample. So we didn't have any pre-assumptions of what the differences might be. We just looked for the largest differences. And we took 7, 8, 10, depending on the data set, the largest differences. And then for each of these variables, we again use this Excel file and the color code, but this time the coloring is between pink, which is for the feminine side, and blue for the masculine side. So if we look at the examples that I'm going to show you, for example, if someone had a high self-esteem, then it will be colored in blue, because on average in this sample, but this is also a general finding, on average men have higher self-esteem compared to women. And if someone was really worried about their weight, then it will be painted pink. Because in this sample, and again, it's very common to find that women are more worried about their weight than men are. So here you see the results of this analysis. There is only one graph of men because there are fewer men than women in this study. Each line is a single human, 7 characteristics of a single human. And you can easily see the sex differences. So women have more pink and men have more blue. And this has to be this way because this is how we define what's feminine, what's pink, and what's masculine, what's blue. The other thing you can see here is that there is quite a lot of blue in the pink and quite a lot of pink in the blue. And this is because for any psychological variable, there is some overlap between men and women. So you can see this overlap. But the question that we were interested in, because this is all known, the question we were interested in is whether there are pink and blue humans. And in this data set, there is not even a single person that has only feminine or only masculine characteristics. About 60% have both blue and pink. So about 60% of this group had some features in which they were highly feminine and others in which they were highly masculine. So you can see that also humans do not come in two types, boys and girls, men and women. But our entire culture is built as if we are. So when a nursery teacher says, boys come take the ball, go play outside, girls come listen to a story, she or he assumes that children come in two types. One type that like to play ball but doesn't want to read stories, and another type that wants stories but doesn't like to play ball. But even with only two preferences, each showing a gender difference. So, because it's probable that more boys and girls prefer to play with a ball and more girls than boys prefer to read stories. But even with only two preferences, there are four types of kids, these two that I've just mentioned, but there are also kids that like to play ball and listen to stories, and of course kids that don't like either of these activities. If we are thinking of more than two preferences, of 4, 5, 6, etc., then of course the number of potential mosaics is enormous. And you can see some of these mosaics in the images that you have in front of you. And I've recently published a book, Gender Mosaic, which talks about the science that I've just showed, but also goes into describing the harms done to boys and girls, men and women, by this gender binary system that is imposed on all of us and squeezes us to fit one of these boxes. And the harms is done, usually we talk about the harm this gender system does to girls and women, but it also harms boys and men in other ways. So I discuss this, and I also suggest my vision of a world without gender, and we can discuss this later. But I want to go back to the question that we started, is about the male and female brain, science or myth. So let's go back from where we started. So we started with what we thought was science, but I hope I managed to convince you that it's a myth, and that the description of how sex affects the body is quite accurate when you think about sex effects on the genitalia. When indeed in most humans can be divided into two types according to the form of their genitalia. But it completely fails when you try to describe sex effects on brains or on gender characteristics. And this is not because there are no differences. There are many differences, but because these differences do not add up consistently, but rather mix up to create unique mosaics. And I want to stress that this is natural. So, and to remind you this image, this is how sex affects the brain. We've seen this in animals. It's not about gender, it's not about culture. It's the nature of sex effects on the brain that they interact with other variables and that they mix up in many different ways to increase variability in the human brain. So it's not about culture or nature versus nurture. This is the nature of sex effects on the brain. And I want to talk about this nature versus nurture question from a different angle now. And this is, why are we obsessed with whether gender differences are natural? Why we are so married to this description of sex effects on the brain? Why people are so interested in finding of sex differences in the brain? And I want to claim that they do this because the myth of the male and female brain is used to legitimize the structure of our society according to the gender binary. So the myth of the male and human brain is used to justify the unequal division of power, of status, etc. in our society between humans with male and female genitalia. And of course, this is not something new. So from the beginning of modern science in the 17th century, we can see scientists talking about the brain. At that time, they were using the skull to talk about the brain because they couldn't measure the brain at that time. But they already knew that the brain was important. And they were looking for differences in the brain to explain female inferiority. And of course, they were not just, at that time, we're not just explaining female inferiority, but they were also explaining the inferiority of non-white humans. They were also trying to explain the inferiority of the poor. So these practices have mostly vanished. We do not see them anymore, but we still see attempts to explain the differences between males and females looking at the brain. So it started at the 17th century when science started to replace religion as a way to explain the world, both the physical world and the social world. And it seems quite easy at the beginning to explain female inferiority because scientists soon realized that the skulls of men were on average larger than the skulls of women. So, you know, larger brains. So this is, now we understand why men are more intelligent than women. And this explains, of course, female inferiority in society. The problem with this explanation, however, was that there are some animals that have much larger skulls than humans, and whales, for example, elephants. So scientists that wanted to explain male superiority over females did not wish to explain the whale's superiority or elephant superiority over humans. So they had some problem, but they soon solved this problem by realizing that the size of the skull proportion the ratio of the size of the skull to the size of the body was larger in humans. So as far as we know, even now, humans have the largest skull to body ratio in all the animal kingdom. Okay, so we can relax. We have now a parameter in which humans are superior to all other animals, but using this measure, then actually females have larger skull to body ratio than males. Now, if you think for 1 second that this made the scientists stop and say, wow, so now we realize that females are actually the more intelligent sex and we simply need to reorganize our society to reflect this. Well, I guess you know that this didn't happen. So they needed to find new explanations of how men are superior to both women and other animals. And the answer was, in this case, with children. So children have a relatively large skull compared to their body. So the story was that it is the ratio that is important, but the normal human development is from a relatively large ratio to a relatively small ratio, and women just simply do not finish their development. So the point here is that it's not really about science. Science is used with a specific target, and science we will use science in this way or the other way, but we need to get to the end that we want to make. So we do not use science to learn about the world, we use it to justify the world. And we jump now to the 19th century, and again, they were talking about the male brains being larger than female brains. Again, this is true. And some scientists use this to explain why women cannot go to universities. And at that time, it was prohibited for women to go to universities. But now we had a reason. It was because of the smaller brains. And of course, this seems ridiculous now when women outnumber men at all levels of academic studies, BA, MA, PhD. So clearly, it's not about the size of the brain, because the size of the brain of women is still smaller on average than the size of the brain of males. It is the social structure that changed, not the brain. And this allowed women to go to universities. And the myth of the male and female brain is still with us. It just, if we talked about skulls and then on the sides of the brain, so now we talk about the strengths of specific connections. So the information that we have about the brain is more sophisticated, but the myth, the way we think about this information has not really changed. And you can see here this study that I showed you before, and what the researcher did with their findings is say that this type of connectivity explains that women's brains are suited to social skills and memory, where men's brains are suited to perception and coordination. So no one today will talk about the inferiority, of course, of women compared to men, but they will describe men and women as belonging to two types. And this will always justify the social stereotypes about men and women. Okay, so I'll stop here. And I want to thank you for listening, and I'll also stop the share so I can see you. I don't see all the... I cannot... How do I stop the share? I don't see I don't see the stop share button. So if you can stop the share for me, this will help. Can someone do this?
Kripa, can you help out?
I'm trying to figure it out.
It might be on the top of the screen.
Yeah, I found it. Okay. Here it is. Okay, and also see there are some questions in the chat. And if you feel like putting on your cameras, it will be nice, but you don't have to.
Okay, I'd like to say just one quick thing. There's Bhavani. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to Bhavani. I see her now on the screen. Before I couldn't see her. Right. So Bhavani is the director of AMMACHI Labs and the Center for Women Equality and Women Empowerment and Gender Equality, and the real powerhouse behind all of what we're doing here. So now I have an opportunity to see. Bhavani, do you have any questions?
Yeah,
Comments?
it was just such a fascinating talk. I mean, as soon as Sid even mentioned your name and he showed us your profile, I was like super excited. So thank you so much. It was so revealing. It was so, I mean, it's just because you're so right. People writes these popular science things on in the newspapers, and they just summarize and they extrapolate on what the implications could be, and then you have the next person touting, oh, this is the great difference between the male and the female brains, and for us, then those of us who are actually working towards gender equality, this becomes a huge challenge in trying to even change perceptions, even among the women themselves, let alone the men. And so your work is so important to everybody who's working in this lab, and thank you so much, really. It's a service to mankind, and in that I think you should be so proud of your work, and really thank you for sharing that knowledge with us. I do have a few questions on the talk. And I realized that while the study gives us a completely different way of actually thinking about these things, and I hadn't even thought of things in the way that you have presented it, and in that sense it completely opens a new world for me. But I do have some doubts in my understanding of what you had talked about. Like, for example, it was I think the last but one study that you showed, where you had the pinks and the blues, and you had this way that you mapped, like, for example, the weight as a female thing, and the self-confidence as a male thing. And I'm just assuming that the population of men and women that you tested were primarily Israeli, or were they populations from different parts of the world, or how did that how did you choose who you worked with? Now, the reason I'm asking this is like, maybe because I just got stuck on one of the examples that you gave. For example, your worriedness about your weight. Like, for example, in Africa, women are considered beautiful if they're fat, not if they're considered thin. So, I mean, like your perceptions about your physical structures, I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter fat or thin. Maybe women are more worried about their physical shape and appearance than men. But sometimes we worry that even these are myths that are propagated. For example, how do we know that women tend to prefer, tend to worry about their weights? Is that something that came from neuroscience, or is that something that came from there's this typical example of how AI basically did the scan of millions of books in the libraries from all across the world, and then they came up with a gender bias that women are more obsessed about how they look, and they define women by, you know, different values, and men by different values like nobility, chivalry, and things like that are what define men, and sensualities and things like that what define women. So how do we know that this is a female trend and this is a male trend? Maybe there's an inherent bias in that. I don't know. But
Okay.
does it not matter? Because one way or the other, it shows there is a difference.
So let me start with this. And of course you are right. So we will find different gender differences in different populations. No doubt about this. And this is what I'm always saying. I do not care where these differences come from. I take a group of people and I look for the differences in that specific group. So the study that I showed, this was a representative sample of American youth, okay? So of course it doesn't have to be true in other regions. But again, for me, it's not what's always true is that regardless of which gender differences you will find in the specific group that you are looking at, the individuals will not have either only feminine characteristics or only masculine characteristics. Each of them will be a mosaic. And I'm sure that you know this about yourself, all of you here. Everyone knows that they have both feminine and masculine characteristics. What people usually do not know is that this is true of everyone else. So they think this is true also about themselves, and maybe they try to hide these characteristics because men, maybe they think it's not appropriate for them to have some feminine characteristics. Women may try not to show their masculine characteristics because sometimes this will have a wrong or strong reaction from the environment, etc. So what is typical of each gender? Of course, it may be different in different cultures. But in each of these cultures, humans will be mosaic. Okay, so that's always true. And in our studies, we never come with preconceptions of what would be feminine and what's masculine. We see what's in the data. Okay? And I want to say something more general because Sid sent me some videos and things to look at what you're doing here, which I'm sorry I didn't say in the beginning, but I think really it's amazing, and I'm really happy that I can contribute even this small talk. It can help this enormous work that you are doing. But I want to say something more general, and this is the vision of a world without gender, and about the importance of gender differences or the lack of importance. If, for example, your child wanted to play chess, you never look at the child's eyes and look, this child, he has brown eyes. Let me see whether people that play chess usually have brown eyes or blue eyes. And then you maybe find out that most chess players have blue eyes, and you tell your child, sorry kid, you cannot play chess. This is for blue eye people and you have brown eyes, and too bad for you, but you cannot do this. Now, the reason we don't do this is not because we know that there are no differences between people with blue eyes and brown eyes in playing chess. We never checked, and you go in the internet, you will not find the answer. So the reason that we do not care about the color of the eyes is not because there are no differences, between people with blue and brown eyes. Probably actually there are such differences because most people with blue eyes are white and many people which are not white usually will have brown eyes. And we know that across the globe, there are many differences, not because the color of the eyes, because there are racism, etc., etc. So, but the reason we do not care about the color of the eyes is that it has no social meaning. It's not because there are no differences. And that's the important point. So in a world without gender, that is a world in which humans with male genitalia, female genitalia, intersex genitalia are all treated equally, as we treat humans with blue and brown eyes. Unfortunately, I do not use skin of color because we are not very good at this, right? But we do not distinguish between the color of the eyes. So in a world without gender, where people are treated according to who they are and not according to the form of the genitalia, I do not know whether there would be group level differences between people with female and male genitalia. Maybe there would be, and maybe there would not be. What I know is that we would not care. As today, we do not care about differences between blue and brown eyes. So when your little kid comes and say, I want to play chess, or I want to play football or whatever, you should not care whether most people that play chess have male or female genitalia. The same as you do not care whether they have blue or brown eyes. If this kid wants to play chess, let them play chess. So that's the point. And what I'm trying to argue is that our obsession with gender differences, with sex differences, with are they true or are they not true, whether they come from nature or nurture, this is all symptoms of the gender binary as a social system. Once we do not care about this division of humans into two types, we would simply stop caring about sex differences and where they come from, not because there would not be such differences, but because they would carry no social meaning. So, and I think this is what's important, to really convey this message to humans, not to try to fight the idea that there are differences, because when you look around, you see many differences. And probably most of them are driven by society, but maybe some are not. But even if they are not driven by society, it doesn't matter. Maybe most women want to play soccer, but I do not want to play soccer. So do I have to play soccer just because most women want to do this? No. Okay, and the other way around. Maybe I want to play soccer and most women don't want to play soccer. So why? But I want to do this. So why can't I do this? So the question is not whether there are differences. We need to fight the gender binary. And we need to fight it as a social system and not turn to nature or science because it's not relevant. We don't do this with other systems. And if I may, I want to say even something in addition to this. In everything else, except sex and I think also race, because I think we are also racist and we are still using this there, but I'm not so sure, but about sex, I'm sure. We are, everything else except sex, we are using our knowledge of nature and of biology to fight it. For example, in medicine, the whole medicine is about understanding the biological basis of a disease, not as a reason to celebrate it, but as a reason or as a way to fight this disease. If someone has cancer, we do not celebrate, oh, finally nature got you and you have cancer. No, we try to fight cancer, knowing the biology of cancer. If we learn about some deficit that prevents a child from acquiring reading skills, we will not celebrate this deficiency and say, oh, this is a gift of nature and this child cannot learn how to read and therefore they should not go to school. We should use, or we would use our knowledge to help this child acquire reading, because reading is necessary for everyone. So why, when it comes to sex, suddenly we celebrate sex or we celebrate nature? Let's say that men were by nature more aggressive. So is this a reason to give men a license to kill? Surely not. It's only a reason to treat boys from a very young age, how to control the violence. And not only boys. If a child is violent, then we need to teach this child how to control his violence. And if a child is not empathic, we need to help this child develop his abilities, empathic abilities. So again, this is the message I'm trying to convey. And I think it goes well with what you're trying to do.
Very much so. Very much so. And if I may add a quick comment on something that you said about the medical science, there's a lot of discussion about, and exactly about the capacity to read and how the mental health of a child is made up. So there's very strong links to nutrition and how it impacts children and it brings down the thing. What your presentation also made me realize, and this is something that has always bothered me, the tendency to say, okay, if the child is malnutrition, then the capacities of the child are impeded in X, Y, and Z ways. And what your presentation made me think, but maybe the reverse is not true. It may influence, maybe definitely there's an influence between nutrition and the mental capacity of a child, that it does impact, but that doesn't mean that the reverse is true. Like, for example, you cannot say, okay, let's say that X million children in India are malnutrition, therefore they all must have a lower cognitive performance than a child from an affluent country, which I think is completely untrue. For example, I'm sure there are equally smart children from India as from the United States, and just doesn't mean that you're malnutritioned or not will necessarily say that whether something about what you presented, and I'm not very sure if my thoughts are exactly right, but that way the way we categorize and the implications that we make is far more difficult, and the way we look at it should be in a little different way. I hope I'm making sense, but something about what you presented and this thing about the capacity of nutrition to impact a child's thing made me make that connection too. And yeah. Thank you. It's just so many more thoughts are there, but I will please not hog the conversation and allow others to. Maybe we can talk offline later. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Yes, hello, this is Sophia. I cannot turn my camera on because then my connection breaks down. But I think thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to say one thing. I think in some way it is okay, at least I think, to celebrate the differences, because not all human beings are the same. And I think there's a danger if we try to look at all people as being the same, that we don't, like there are certain feminine qualities, they can be in men and in women, like being like nurturing, being compassionate, and being empathetic. I mean, it can be in both men and women. But there's a danger that these qualities are just kind of not appreciated. And that happened in the 1970s, feminism. Like then at least in Europe, all the feminine qualities were kind of just completely not appreciated anymore. And I think there's a danger of not appreciating the diversity of human nature if we think, oh, there's no, like if we don't appreciate the differences. I mean, of course, you say there are differences, but I think it's also, in some way, we can also celebrate the differences.
Right, so what I do not think we should do is divide humans into two types. This is not celebrating diversity. This is celebrating two types. Two types is not diversity. I suggest we celebrate human diversity, and human diversity is that each of us is a unique mosaic. This is diversity. And the gender binary, what it does is that instead of meeting people and seeing the unique mosaic of combination of characteristics, we see them as two types. We see them men and women. This is very boring. This is not diversity. And I completely agree regarding devaluation of what is considered feminine qualities. I agree with you. This is what I think is why I think we need to think what qualities we want. We want to have, we want everyone to be able to have empathy and nurturing, and also some type of assertiveness. It's good for humans. They can protect themselves. They can protect others. They need to be assertive. So it's not something that only men need. So these are all human qualities, and we should encourage them in everyone. The way our society is built right now is that some qualities are classified as appropriate for one gender, but not the other, and some characteristics are qualified the other way. And this is bad for all of us, because each of us is mosaic, because we all need all these properties. It's good for humans to be athletic, to be good in mathematics, to be assertive, to be empathic, to be nurturing. This is a full human being. What we are raising, typically, at least in Western countries, I'm not so familiar with other societies. So in Western countries, we are raising boys that lack in emotional abilities, and we are raising girls that lack in their ability to possess power, to use power. And this is important. Humans should be able to use their power in positive ways. But still, if you are ashamed to have power, if you are not feeling comfortable with exerting your power, you cannot do good things. So this is important. And I think we should raise humans that can both be emotional and have power. This is important. And I think this is what you are trying to do in your society. So I do not think that a gender-free world is a world in which we are all the same. No, it's a world in which we can celebrate that each person is unique. I see some of the comments in the chat.
I'll take advantage of the fact that that I'm here doing this. A quick point and a quick question. The point is that IQ was used for similar purposes, social purposes. Scientists aren't really all that interested in IQ. It doesn't, the science behind it is not particularly important. The social side of it is very important. So there's a wonderful book by Stephen Jay Gould called The Mismeasure of Man. And in the book, he writes about how it is that people used IQ as ways to stop immigration or let immigration happen, so that people who were considered problematic for all kinds of reasons, the tests showed, or they were built in such a way that they would discriminate against certain groups of people, therefore they weren't allowed in, or they were being scrutinized much more. Two groups in particular that I remember that were thought to be low IQ were Italians and Jews. And this is just a way of keeping the Italians and the Jews out of the United States, because they had characteristics that people did not want. And this is using IQ for social purposes. And it just sort of rang a bell when you were talking about this with gender and sex, that how it is that society uses these the binary issue as a way of maintaining itself and the power structures there. The question I had was, what does all of this have to, I'm sure you've heard this question a million times, it'll be 1,000,001. What does this then have to do with the way you're presenting things with, I never know the alphabet, but homosexuals and lesbians and queers and whatever it is, the list is getting longer, the alphabet list. So what does that mean about that, where people feel, in some cases, they feel that their body is one thing, and then their desires and their personalities don't fit their body. So what is this that, what you're talking about, how does that address it?
Okay, so we have also studied gender identity and sexuality, and for sexuality, I'm sure you know that most people feel sexually attracted to both sexes. But most people are more attracted to the other sex than to their own sex. But bisexual attractions, not defining oneself as bisexual, this is quite rare. But having sexual attraction to both genders, this is actually quite common, even though it is in most societies not appropriate to be sexually attracted to your own sex. But we also show this with gender identity. So many cisgenders individuals, so people that self-identify in the same way as a sex assigned at birth, many of them can also sometimes feel as the other gender, not as only their own gender. So also gender identity is much less binary than we are made to think. So this model, the gender binary is a whole model according to which humans are male or female. They will grow up to be boys and men and attracted to women, or girls and women and attracted to men. But this is, again, this is not true. So homosexual men can be highly masculine, homosexual women can be highly feminine. This idea that homosexual men are more feminine and homosexual women are more masculine, this is all part of the gender binary. It's not part of reality. So in truth, we can have our body and we can be sexually attractive to anyone, and we can have masculine and feminine characteristics, and our gender identity can be more complex than this or that. My view is that we should celebrate variability instead of trying to push humans into two boxes. So this is my view of this. There was a question about how, in the chat, about how we can make a difference in the discourse. So first, I agree that it's a problem, but I think the even greater problem is the social structure and the power relations that we live in. So patriarchy, if you want, and it's not only about male and female, it's also about race or color or whatever you want to call it. It's very difficult to fight. And it's a very strong system, and it's often managed to twist things and then make it serve its purposes or maintain the dynamic. So it's very difficult to change, but people have changed it before. So if you think about women 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, we didn't have the power to or the right to vote, and now women all over the world are voting. And you can also look at other domains where changes have been made. So it's difficult to change the discourse, but I think what I found with the mosaic is that people can receive it more easily than other types of stories or changes of discourse, because it fits what they know about the world. And this is what I said before. If you try to convince people that there are no differences between men and women, they simply would not listen, because they look around and they see the differences. And it doesn't matter where the differences come from. You cannot say that they are the same because they see the differences. But if you say there are differences, but each person is a mosaic, and they know this because they know this about themselves. So it's easier for them because they don't need to give up what they know about the world. They know about the world that there are differences. They know that they themselves are mosaic. The only thing that they need to change is to understand that everyone is mosaic, and therefore that the gender binary is not making sense. But they don't need to give up their knowledge that, but boys like football more than girls do. Yeah, true. Maybe it will change in some other place, but it's true now. So I think it's better to go after the idea of two types, is to talk about what we did before. So maybe there are differences, but why does this mean that your kid cannot go to play chess because it's more typical of boys and she is a girl, etc. So I think it's easier to talk about this and to show how it doesn't make sense than to try to convince people that all humans are the same, which also it's not true. We are not all the same, we are all different. But I agree that it's difficult to do this. But I think this is what you are trying to do. And I think working with children is really important. And I think empowering women is really important. but we all have a long way to go. Are there more comments or questions?
Hi, Daphna. I was speaking to you earlier. This is Kripa. It's not really a question. I'm just really encouraged to hear everything you're saying. This is one of the things that we kept coming back to. Our lab was asked by UNESCO India to write kind of a roadmap on engaging men and boys in gender equality and looking at changing like the norms of masculinity in Indian society to a more gender equitable level. And the thing that one other person and I were really working on this a lot the last 6-7 months. And the thing that we kept coming back to is this hegemonic system within a patriarchal superstructure, but then also working with children to deconstruct the gender binaries that are so culturally entrenched. And so this is really, really interesting and really encouraging. So I'm super interested I'm going to see if I can find your book actually online. But thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and I agree with you. I think our next step is really to recruit boys and men, and the way to do it is not to say that they need to help women and girls, but they need to understand that the gender binary is also harmful for boys and men.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree, and I really believe that they get hurt from this system in other ways, but we are not in competition of who is getting more damage from this system.
Right.
It's bad for all of us, and we need to work together to change it. Yeah.
Do we have time for another quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Daphna Joel. How are you?
Hi.
I have no word, speechless about the results, and it's amazing. So I'd like to take it to another layer. Obviously, everything you suggested is, I guess, taking the science and showing that the social is so much more influential on our life, and that's quite amazing, because people look around and they see the difference, the physical difference between men and women, and then they assume stuff that we didn't know. And I think what you've done is comparable with the revolution in physics, where it's still tough to get people used to it, where Einstein says there is no space and time, they're not different, it's the same thing. And you're saying there is no gender, there's just like a continuum of mosaics of brains, which is really, really interesting approach to the whole thing. Although gender or sex, whatever they is named, is already in the social fabric, and as you suggested, the same way as folk physics has time and space, and people think in those terms because it works in the. So that was like one comment. I think you've done an incredible thing with the continuum of mosaics. The question that I had, and I actually had it before the lecture because I wasn't sure what you're going to suggest. You might know that some of us are working with neural networks. These are artificial kind of analogies to brains, in a sense, in some very far sense. And the first question that I had when I listened to you, when I saw that you're about to lecture about that topic, was whether you think that we should be trying to find women or sorry, I don't know how to say that, male networks and female networks, in a sense that if we train them differently, as society does, we would get kind of different solutions to the same problem. As the way I see it is like we have a surface and there are like two peaks on the surface, and women brains would kind of converge to one peak and men would converge to another peak. But what you've just kind of said kind of took the sting from my question, but still I'm asking, so if there is a continuum, whether you think that there are ways to try to find a way to transfer that into artificial neural networks in some way.
So I don't know about the last, but what I can say that what's amazing actually and surprising is that given that there is sex and it affects the brain, and there is gender as a social system that treats boys and girls differently from day one, it's amazing that brains and humans do not come in two types, and we do not see these two peaks, as you call it, but rather that we are, every one of us is a mixture. So what we see in humans, and this is true of evolution and the idea of sex in general, is that sexual reproduction, the whole point of it is to create more variability rather than less variability. The only place in the human body where sex creates less variability in the sex is in the genitalia, or in the reproductive system, where if we had this mosaic, we would not be able to reproduce. But the idea of sexual reproduction is to create more variability, because this increases the chances of the species as a whole to survive changes. And I think this may also be true for artificial intelligence. The more solutions you have, or the more ways you can solve a single problem, then the more resilient your system is to interference, to damage, etc. Because it can always use a different path. It doesn't have only one path. But this is quite far-fetched. I think we need to end, because I have other things for the morning, and I'm sure you also do, and we're already a little past the time. So Sid, is it
yeah,
okay?
It's more than okay. Daphna, thank you so very, very much, really. What a wonderful talk. And from what you already heard, it really got people thinking about what it is that their presuppositions were and are about the topics that you're dealing with, and in particular the people working in women empowerment and gender equality. I'm sure that there'll be many discussions afterwards, and you were responsible for that. That's fantastic. I'm also happy that you mentioned the clips that I sent and that you looked at. Amrita University is really a unique place, and it's not only science for the sake of knowledge, it's that, but it's also science in the service of humanity. And that's the DNA of this university. And what you were talking about really fits so well with that DNA, with the core ethics of what the university is about, and what science, one of the purposes of science. So thank you again. You were very generous to accept and to give us your time.
Thank you, and I put a link in the chat for the book if anyone is interested, so you don't have to look for it. And thank you for inviting me, and good luck to all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Daphna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you. Bye.